Tokyo, September 1941. Inside the wood-paneled conference rooms of the Imperial General Headquarters, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and destiny. The men sitting around these tables, generals of the army and admirals of the navy, are facing a crisis. The United States has imposed a crushing oil embargo. The clock is ticking. Japan has less than 2 years of oil reserves left. If they do nothing, their war machine stops. If they retreat from China, they lose their honor. So, they choose the third path, war. But to fight the United States is to fight a continent. How does a small island nation defeat the world's largest industrial economy? The Japanese High Command believed they had the answer. It was a strategy built not on steel, but on psychology. They called it spirit over material. They looked across the Pacific at America, and they saw a nation that was broken. The United States was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. It was a country divided by isolationism. To the samurai class of the Imperial Army, Americans were soft, hedonistic, and spoiled by capitalism. They believed the average American cared more about his new car and his radio than fighting a war in a jungle thousands of miles away. This cultural arrogance led to the most dangerous spreadsheet in military history. Imperial Intelligence began to run the numbers. They looked at the United States Navy. In 1941, the US Navy was a volunteer force. It was professional, but it was small. The Japanese intelligence analysts estimated the strength of the US Navy personnel at approximately 296,000 men. To the Japanese planners, this number was manageable. But their fatal error was in predicting how that number would change. They reasoned that a democracy could not conscript men easily. They believed that training a sailor took years of discipline. They calculated that even if America mobilized, it would take them 5, maybe 10 years to build a fleet capable of challenging Japan. By then, the war would be over. The plan was the short war. Strike Pearl Harbor, cripple the fleet, seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Create a defensive perimeter so strong that when the Americans finally tried to counterattack, they would bleed so much that they would beg for a peace treaty. They were betting that America had a breaking point. But there was one man in the room who didn't smile at the projections. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was different. He hadn't just read about America. He had lived there. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He didn't look at America and see softness. He looked at America and saw Detroit. He saw Pittsburgh. He saw the oil fields of Texas. He famously warned the Prime Minister, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." Yamamoto tried to tell them that the number 296,000 sailors was an illusion. He knew that the moment the first bomb dropped, the American spirit they despised would vanish, replaced by a cold, industrial rage. He knew that behind those 296,000 sailors stood a population of 130 million people who knew how to fix engines, build skyscrapers, and mass-produce automobiles. But the War Council didn't want to hear about smokestacks and assembly lines. They were drunk on the idea of a decisive battle. They believed that a quick, violent shock would break the American will. So, the orders were cut. The fleet sailed. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked. They destroyed the battleships. They killed over 2,000 Americans. Tactically, it was a masterpiece. But strategically, it was a suicide note. Because on that Sunday morning, Japan didn't just bomb a naval base. They tore up the spreadsheet. They released the constraints on the American economy. The Japanese High Command went to sleep on December 7th, thinking they had neutralized the 296,000 sailors. They had no idea that they had just signed the recruitment papers for the next 2 million. The bet on a short war was lost the moment the first torpedo hit the water. The giant wasn't just sleeping, it was waiting to be unleashed. The 8th of December, 1941, The smoke over Pearl Harbor is still clearing. In Tokyo, there is celebration. In Berlin, Hitler is ecstatic. They believe the United States has been crippled. They see a nation in shock, a democracy too slow and too divided to fight a modern, total war. But they were looking at the wrong map. They were looking at battleships. They should have been looking at the balance sheets of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Admiral Yamamoto's fear was about to become a terrifying reality. The sleeping giant didn't just wake up. It went to work with a fury the world had never seen. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a directive that sounded impossible. He didn't just ask for a military buildup. He demanded the complete suspension of the American civilian economy. In 1941, the United States produced over 3 million civilian automobiles. In 1942, throughout the entire year, the number of cars produced was exactly 139. The assembly lines of Detroit stopped making sedans. Within weeks, the tooling was ripped out. The concrete floors were reinforced. And suddenly, the factories that made family cars were churning out tanks, airplane engines, and machine guns. At Willow Run in Michigan, Henry Ford built a factory that was a mile long. Critics said it was too big to manage. But soon, raw aluminum went in one end, and a B-24 Liberator bomber came out the other. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one heavy bomber every 63 minutes. Japan was building airplanes by hand, with skilled craftsmen treating each zero like a work of art. The United States was building airplanes like they were toaster ovens. But the real miracle happened in the shipyards. The Japanese Navy relied on complex, beautiful ship designs that took years to construct. The Americans turned to a man named Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a construction magnate who had built dams. He didn't care about naval tradition. He cared about speed. He looked at a ship and didn't see a vessel. He saw a floating building. He introduced prefabrication. Instead of laying the keel and building up, Kaiser built sections of the ship all over the shipyard and then welded them together like a massive Lego set. The result was the Liberty ship. Before the war, building a cargo ship took about 240 days. Kaiser got it down to 40 days. Then 20 days. In a publicity stunt that broke the spirit of Axis intelligence officers, the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary was laid down on a Sunday. It was launched the following Thursday. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. While Japan was struggling to replace a single lost destroyer, the United States was launching entire fleets in a week. And then there was the human element. The 296,000 sailors that Japan had counted, that number was obliterated. The US Navy didn't just build ships, they built a conveyor belt for human beings. Universities across the country were commandeered. Yale, Harvard, Princeton, they became officer training camps. Young men who had never seen the ocean were turned into 90-day wonders. Officers trained in navigation and gunnery in 3 months flat. In the Great Lakes, far from the ocean, the Navy bought huge paddle wheel steamers and converted them into training aircraft carriers. Pilots learned to land on a moving deck in the safety of Lake Michigan before shipping out to the Pacific. It was a mobilization of absolute totality. By 1943, the United States was launching a new aircraft carrier every month, a new destroyer every 3 days. The Japanese logistics officers looked at the reports coming from their spies, and they thought the Americans were lying. The numbers didn't make sense. No nation could produce that much steel, that much oil, and that many men. But the numbers were real. The Japanese had started a war with a finite amount of chips on the table. They were playing poker. The United States wasn't playing poker. They were buying the casino. As 1943 dawned, the sleeping giant was fully armored, and it was about to reach across the Pacific with a hand made of solid steel. 1942. The Solomon Islands. This is where the Pacific War stopped being a chess match and became a knife fight in a dark room. For 6 months, in the waters around Guadalcanal, a place the sailors called Iron Bottom Sound, the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy slammed into each other, night after night. Ships were sunk, damaged, and patched up. On the surface, it looked like a stalemate. In the Battle of Santa Cruz in October, the Americans lost the carrier Hornet. The Enterprise was badly damaged. The Japanese claimed a tactical victory. But in the spreadsheet of war, Japan was bleeding to death. Admiral Yamamoto's strategy relied on the decisive battle. He wanted to lure the American fleet out, destroy it in one afternoon, and end the war. But the Americans refused to play by his rules. Instead, they forced Japan into a war of attrition. A war of attrition is not about who is better. It is about who can bleed longer. And this is where the two nations' philosophies collided with fatal results. The most critical resource in 1942 was not oil or steel. It was pilots. At the start of the war, the Japanese naval aviator was the finest warrior in the sky. He was a samurai of the air, trained for years, selected from thousands of applicants. He was an artist. But the Japanese training system was rigid and elitist. It produced a few hundred gods, but it could not produce thousands of soldiers. And crucially, Japan had a fatal policy. Their aces did not rotate home. A Japanese ace flew until he died. He took his experience, his secrets, and his skills to the grave with him. The Americans did the opposite. When an American pilot survived a tour of duty, he was sent back to the States. He didn't go to the beach. He went to the flight schools. He taught the rookies how to survive. He taught them how to beat the zero. The result was a terrifying degradation of the Japanese Air Force. By late 1943, the skies were filled not with the elite veterans of Pearl Harbor, but with frightened teenagers who had barely learned to take off. The Americans, meanwhile, were sending up wave after wave of competent, well-trained predators. Then there was the ships. When a Japanese carrier was damaged, it had to limp back to Japan. It would sit in a dry dock for months, starved of spare parts, worked on by laborers who were increasingly malnourished. When an American carrier was damaged, it often didn't even go home. At the Battle of Midway, the USS Yorktown was repaired in 48 hours by 1,400 men working around the clock with sledgehammers. At Guadalcanal, the USS Enterprise fought battles with repair crews, still welding holes on her decks while planes were taking off. The disparity became a chasm. In late 1942, Japan lost the Hiei and the Kirishima, two fast battleships. They could not be replaced. The slipways in Japan were empty. But in the shipyards of the American East Coast, something was happening that would haunt the nightmares of the Japanese High Command. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, passed back in 1940, was finally bearing fruit. The gestation period was over. Japan had spent 1,943 thinking they were holding the line. They thought they had time, but they didn't know that the Essex-class aircraft carriers were coming. These weren't converted cruisers or hasty retrofits. These were the most advanced warships ever built, and they weren't building one, they were building 24 of them. Alongside them came the Independence-class light carriers, 9 of them, and the Baltimore-class cruisers, and the Fletcher-class destroyers. While Japan was celebrating the sinking of a single American destroyer, the United States was launching a new task force every fiscal quarter. By the end of 1943, the trap had snapped shut. Japan had spent its precious reserves of men and ships fighting for islands that didn't matter. They had traded their queens for American pawns. Now, the board was empty for Japan. But on the American side of the horizon, a storm of steel was gathering. The replacement war was over. The annihilation was about to begin, late 1944. The Pacific Ocean. If you want to understand why Japan surrendered, you don't need to look at Hiroshima. You simply need to look at a remote, donut-shaped coral reef in the Caroline Islands called Ulithi Atoll. For centuries, Ulithi was nothing but a quiet lagoon, home to a few hundred natives and some palm trees. But in late 1944, it suddenly became the third largest naval base on planet Earth. Imagine you are a Japanese reconnaissance pilot. You are flying a high-altitude sortie over the Pacific, looking for the American fleet. You expect to see a task force, maybe 2 carriers, a few battleships, a dozen destroyers. Instead, you look down, and your mind refuses to comprehend what it sees. The ocean has disappeared. In its place is a solid pavement of gray steel. Anchored in the lagoon are not 10 ships, not 50. There are 600 ships. This is the murderer's row. It is the physical manifestation of the industrial miracle. There, sitting side by side, are the new Essex-class fleet carriers. The Wasp, the Yorktown, the Hornet, the Intrepid, the Lexington. The Japanese had sunk the original Wasp, Yorktown, Hornet, and Lexington years ago. They thought those ships were gone forever. But the United States had just built new ones, bigger and stronger, and gave them the exact same names. To the Japanese, it must have felt like fighting an army of ghosts that refused to stay dead. And then, there are the numbers. Remember the Japanese estimate? They calculated the US Navy would top out at 296,000 men. They believed a democracy could not find enough sailors to man a global fleet. By 1944, the personnel count of the United States Navy stands at 2,034,343. It is an error of nearly 700%. The US Navy is now larger than the entire population of some European countries. It is a force so vast that it has its own zip codes. But the ships and the men are only half the terror. The real nightmare for Japan, the thing that truly signals the end, is what is happening between the warships. Japan's strategy relied on the fact that fleets have to go home. A ship needs fuel, ammunition, food, and repairs. This tether limits how far and how long a navy can fight. But at Ulithi, the Americans broke the laws of naval warfare. They didn't go home, they brought home with them. It was called Service Squadron 10. Floating in the lagoon are massive dry docks, artificial islands, capable of lifting a 40,000-ton battleship out of the water for repairs. There are tanker ships that act as floating gas stations. There are hospital ships. There are floating warehouses, baking 10,000 loaves of bread a day. And most insultingly of all, there is the ice cream barge. While Japanese soldiers on isolated islands are starving to death, surviving on roots and rats, the US Navy has commissioned a concrete barge dedicated entirely to producing 500 gallons of ice cream every single shift. It is the ultimate flex of logistics. It sends a message that is louder than any cannon. We have so much capacity, so much surplus, and so much fuel that we can tow a floating ice cream factory across the Pacific Ocean just to keep our sailors happy. The Japanese admirals look at their maps. They realize they are no longer fighting a navy. They are fighting a moving continent. The Sea of Steel is not just approaching Japan. It is suffocating it. The blockade is total. The sky is filled with dark blue American planes. The horizon is jagged with American masts. The 2 million sailors are no longer a statistic on a piece of intelligence paper. They are here. And they have brought the entire industrial weight of the Western Hemisphere with them. The math is undeniable. The war is over. The fighting will continue. The dying will continue. But the result is now a mathematical certainty. August 1945. The endgame. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast barrier that protected the Japanese Empire, has become a prison. The short war that Tokyo planned for in 1941 has dragged on for 1,300 days. And now, the bill has come due. Japan is being strangled. The United States submarines, the Silent Service, have sunk the merchant fleet. The oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies are at the bottom of the sea. The bauxite from Malaya never arrives. The factories in Osaka and Nagoya stand silent, not just because they have been bombed, but because there is nothing left to melt down. The Japanese war economy has not just stalled, it has ceased to exist. On the home islands, civilians are reduced to eating sawdust bread and boiling pine roots for sustenance. Fuel is so scarce that the Imperial Navy cannot even sortie its remaining battleships. They sit in port, camouflaged with tree branches, helpless targets for American carrier planes. But the ultimate humiliation is not the firebombing. It is not the starvation. It is the visible, undeniable abundance of the enemy. In the final months of the war, American supply ships are offloading cargo on islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. They aren't just offloading ammunition. They are offloading fresh eggs, steaks, Coca-Cola, movies. The Japanese high command preached spirit over material. They told their soldiers that American softness would crumble before the samurai spirit. But on the battlefield, the Japanese soldier realized the terrifying truth. He was fighting an enemy that didn't need to choose between guns and butter. America had enough steel to build the gun and enough logistics to fly in the butter. There is a famous story of a Japanese colonel on a bypassed island. He looks through his binoculars and sees an American supply barge. He expects to see weapons. Instead, he sees a vessel designed solely to manufacture ice cream. At that moment, the ideological foundation of the empire collapses. How do you defeat an enemy who can ship luxury desserts to the front lines of a global war while your own troops are starving? It was a psychological checkmate. The United States hadn't just outfought Japan. They had outproduced, outshipped, and outorganized them to a degree that defied comprehension. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were the final punctuation marks on a sentence that had already been written. The war had been lost long before the Enola Gay took off. It was lost in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California, and the assembly lines of Detroit. On the 2nd of September, 1945, the surrender is signed on the deck of the USS Missouri. Take a look at that scene. The Missouri is an Iowa-class battleship, one of the most powerful machines ever built. Surrounding it in Tokyo Bay are thousands of Allied ships. Planes darken the sky. It is a sea of steel that stretches to the horizon. And somewhere in the archives of the defeated Japanese Navy, there is that old piece of paper from 1941. The estimate, the prediction that the United States could only muster 296,000 sailors. As General Douglas MacArthur signs the documents ending World War II, the reality stands around him. Over 3.4 million Americans are now serving in the naval forces. The US Navy possesses 6,768 ships. It operates 85,000 aircraft. The fatal miscalculation is complete. Japan gambled that the giant would sleep. Instead, they woke a force of nature. And in the cold, hard math of industrial warfare, there was never any other possible outcome. The empire is gone. But the lesson remains. Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics.